You know, there's a trend I've been noticing lately. Every time a superhero gets some superpowers, somebody else ends up paying the price. This is because behind every mutation, serum, and enhancement in Marvel history, there's a lab, a scientist, and a person who never consented to what happened next. Now, don't get me wrong, some of these superheroes turned into legends, like Wolverine, Captain America, and even Spider-Man, but others, the ones who weren't as lucky, well, they turned into footnotes, erased from the records because their bodies didn't or couldn't survive the process. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the 10 most disturbing experiments in Marvel Comics, and this list includes not just the X-Men, but also government black sites, immortal geneticists, and secret trials buried across the entire Marvel Universe. So grab your popcorn, hit the like button, just in case, and get ready to witness 10 of the most horrifying experiment stories in the Marvel Universe. It's going to be a good one, so let's get right into it. Weapon X, Wolverine's adamantium bonding. Decades before Logan was recognized as Wolverine and turned into a living legend, he was actually a prisoner who was called by a number instead of having a proper identity. The program that made him nearly indestructible wasn't a standalone project at all either. It was actually the 10th installment or trial of a much larger initiative called Weapon Plus. Weapon Plus was a clandestine effort to build super soldiers for future wars, including a feared war between mutants and humans. In fact, Captain America was actually the first ever project made by Weapon Plus. This is why he's regarded as Weapon 1, whereas Wolverine was actually Weapon X, and the X stands for the number 10. The entire project was run out of Canada's Department K, so the program didn't have the chance to design its own subjects, so they decided to capture Logan instead, who was already a former CIA Team X operative and Department K asset. At first, things seemed normal enough, and Logan thought he would return to his life after the experiment, but scientists, led by Professor Thornton, stripped him of choice entirely. They used genetic engineering and cybernetics to force away restraint and turn him into a living assassin, but the cruelty up to this point wasn't enough. His handlers tactically built numerous scenarios that were completely fake and set up false sets to stage new memories so that they could truly make him believe that whatever he was remembering was the truth, and this gave them an amount of control over Logan's sense of who he was. He was far from being Weapon X's only experiment, though, and eventually that same machinery was turned on operatives like Sabretooth, Deadpool, and even Spider-Man in one universe, proving that Weapon X was not a one-time atrocity, but a repeated production line for weaponizing human beings. Project Rebirth and the World War II Super Soldier tests. According to many comics, Steve Rogers wasn't the first person the government tried the super soldier serum on, but he was the first one who the government let live in the history books for others to see. In comics, this project is often referred to as Project Rebirth, and this program started off as a joint effort among American, British, and German scientists. While Dr. Reinstein's American branch eventually produced Captain America, his early formula attempts were tested on black soldiers first in order to make sure that the first perfect soldier would be the pinnacle of human evolution. This program was obviously pretty exploitative and racist, so, there's that. 300 black soldiers were taken in as test subjects from Camp Cathcart, and their entire goal was to recreate the super soldier serum, but unfortunately, most of them never made it out alive. The problem was that the organization never really fully recreated the serum, so all 300 of them were given the unfinished version, and this ended up causing the soldiers to either die instantly or face major side effects that were even worse than death. Out of the 300 soldiers, only 5 of them actually survived, but this experiment was already way too unethical, so in order to keep the program under wraps, numerous soldiers were ordered to execute the camp's commander, along with the black soldiers left behind, while the families of the victims were simply told their sons had died in battle. The only person who actually managed to survive this hellish project was Isaiah Bradley, but survival didn't mean freedom. Instead of being honored and treated like a national treasure like Captain America, he was immediately sentenced to life in prison for supposedly disobeying orders, and his legacy stayed buried for decades. Sadly, this story deliberately mirrors things that actually happened to people in real life, and Marvel deliberately drew comparison to the Tuskegee syphilis study, where black men were experimented on without informed consent. This storyline is arguably one of the most disturbing entries on this entire list, not because of the story, but because of the real-life incidents that inspired it. Genosha's mutate bonding program. Genosha was a place that never even bothered to pretend that mutants were citizens. Every child born on that island was tested for the mutant gene, and the moment it showed up, they stopped being a person and started being the island's property until they died. David Moreau, often referred to as Gene Engineer, basically designed a process where any child that identified as a carrier was taken away and their free will was stripped away until they turned into obedient mutates who would listen to orders without questioning them twice. The thing about this process was that David Moreau designed it, but it was more like a handoff to him. The person who actually came up with and engineered this entire thing was a much darker figure, a twisted geneticist from the Age of Apocalypse known as Sugar Man. The biggest issue with his procedure is that it unfolded in multiple layers, and each layer was worse than the one before. The first stage alone was designed to humiliate as much as control. In this stage, a colorized suit was chemically fused directly to the subject's skin, and this was used to brand them instantly as government property, while also being sealed to process waste and specifically block reproduction. You might think that after this step, they would work on suppressing the mutant kid's powers, but that would actually be more humane than what they really did. In reality, this entire process of branding would reshape exactly how the kid would express their mutation and basically retool them as workers who were made to plug labor shortages, or else their organs would be harvested from them for rich people who were in need of them. Genosha's mutates weren't an isolated incident either. These mutates were the backbone of an entire economy. The entire nation's wealth was built directly on enslaved mutant labor, and it was run as a functioning apartheid state where citizenship was permanent and escape meant being hunted down. The worst part is that this wasn't just some rogue evil scientist, it was an entire national government. Arnim Zola's genetic abominations. In the Marvel Universe, most Nazi scientists and villains died in the war itself, but there was one person who was smarter than all of them, Arnim Zola. I say he's smarter than the rest because he managed to engineer his way out of that fate entirely, and on top of that, he kept on experimenting for the better part of a century. Zola was a Swiss-born prodigy, and he used his brilliance to support the Third Reich, where he literally pioneered human genetic engineering and mind transfer science to such an extent that it was decades ahead of anything the rest of the world even theorized, and this even earned him status as Earth-616's first true human geneticist. The funny part, or at least the ironic part, is that all this brain, all this intelligence, none of this was because of human knowledge at all. The actual reason was that Zola became a mad biochemist after he deciphered numerous scientific notes that were left behind by ancient deviants. And once he realized what he could achieve with all this info, he used the stolen alien-adjacent biotechnology to rewrite the rules of life itself. The worst part about evil geniuses like this is they love to challenge the idea of death, and death wasn't even an obstacle for Zola. He knew his mortal body could only live so long before expiring, so he digitized and transferred his own consciousness into a robotic body, and this was how he was able to conduct experiment after experiment without any interruptions well into the modern era. You might be thinking that's a pretty clever move, but it's actually the most unsettling part about him. His current form fuses an exposed organic brain directly into a mechanical chest cavity crowned by the ESP box that serves as his sensory and psychic interface. Told ya, it's not exactly fun, not even for him. He's committed so many atrocities over the years, and yet these are all just bottom of the barrel because he didn't just save his consciousness, he also used that same technology to clone Adolf Hitler's consciousness and fathered two genetically engineered children called Ian and Jet, where he treated human reproduction as just another lab process he could route around. We can't really sum up the horror of Arnim Zola with a single atrocity. He turned his own body into a permanent laboratory with no retirement, no death, and apparently no limit on how many decades he was willing to keep on experimenting. True evil mixed with genius is one of the scariest things in the world. Mr. Sinister's Marauders and the Mutant Massacre. Nathaniel Essex was once regarded as one of Victorian England's most respected biologists, and he was obsessed with the theories of Charles Darwin. But once his son passed away, he stopped caring about respectability altogether. His son was born with a few birth defects, which caused him to pass away soon after birth. Essex couldn't accept this loss, and he determined that morality had no place in scientific research, so he set out to create and engineer what he claimed to be a perfect human race. From then on, consent wasn't an option for his victims. For years, his hired gang terrorized the streets of 1860s London, where they dragged homeless and forgotten people straight into his laboratory. Apocalypse, one of the biggest and baddest villains in the Marvel Universe, later found him and remade him into something closer to immortal, and trust me when I say this, the name Mr. Sinister stuck for a good reason. Usually, after attaining that level of power, people change their ideologies, for better or for worse. But in the case of Sinister, his obsession just grew, and soon it turned genocidal. Sinister ordered his enforcers, the genetically engineered Marauders, to wipe out the Morlocks entirely, and if you don't know who the Morlocks are, they're a mostly peaceful community of mutants who used to live beneath New York City in the sewers. Their mutant abilities affected their appearance so radically that they just couldn't fit in with regular society, and they didn't feel comfortable living in the X-Mansion. They would pay for the crime of looking different with their lives. The trigger was almost bureaucratic in its coldness, and so much worse than many people understand. Sinister learned of the Morlocks' existence, and without a second thought, he quietly arranged their extermination simply because he judged them scientifically worthless and a contaminant to the mutant gene pool he was curating. The worst part was that the Marauders didn't even stop at the sewers because Sinister had another goal in mind. He had secretly been observing Cyclops' family for quite some time, and to test out the Marauders, he gave them their first mission: hunt down Cyclops' wife and infant son so that he could simply study their genetic lineage. He could have just pretended to be a doctor or a medical professional to get their blood, but I mean, what would you expect from a guy who deemed his child's death as a mortal defect rather than just mourning him? People aren't people to Mr. Sinister. They're simply data points in a genome he considers his own and edits with the unearned confidence of a god. The High Evolutionary's New Men. Does the name Herbert Wyndham ring a bell? Well, if you're a die-hard Marvel fan, you might already know about him, but if you don't know who he is, well, you're about to. You see, Herbert Wyndham never really wanted to be viewed as a monster. He just knew evolution was still ongoing, and he wanted to be the one to finish evolution's job for it. Working from a citadel on Mount Wundagore, Wyndham built the New Men in 1932 by genetically evolving ordinary animals into intelligent humanoid beings by using specific mutagens, like his self-devised genetic accelerator, which essentially forced millions of years of natural selection onto creatures that never asked for hands, speech, or even self-awareness. Many people thought he was simply building companions, but they couldn't have been more wrong. After a few experiments, Wyndham realized that these new creatures were pretty useful, and since then, he started using them as personal aides and loyal soldiers who would help him with his future experiments. Unfortunately, his hunger for genetic material was just way too much to stop at animals. When a demonic incursion at his citadel coincided with the birth of twins on the mountain, Wyndham didn't even hesitate to treat the newborns as raw research material, and the best part, those twins were none other than Wanda and Pietro Maximoff, Quicksilver and the Scarlet Witch. Wyndham knew that these two kids could be really strong, so he experimented on them to such an extent that he altered their genetics and ended up granting them powers that would literally define their lives. The only problem was that the experiments he did on them were extremely inhumane, and consent was not even an option in his eyes, even when it came to infants or the parents the babies had been separated from. When Earth stopped being a big enough lab, he simply decided to build another one. Yeah, this guy is pretty nuts. Wyndham would eventually relocate his experiments to counter Earth, which was literally an entire artificial planet, until his own creation, known as Man-Beast, led the New Men in open revolt against him. The most disturbing part about Wyndham wasn't even his experiments, it was the fact that he truly didn't see any of this as cruel. In his mind, he was just perfecting the imperfect, and that is low-key scary, in my opinion. Weapon Plus and the creation of X-23. You thought we were done with the Weapon Plus program? Well, so did most people, but Marvel just keeps on bringing them back for more and more atrocities. By now, we know that the Weapon X program built Wolverine into the killing machine he is today, and they did it out of a man who was fully grown. The sad thing is, Weapon Plus saw Wolverine as the project's biggest success and decided to build a Wolverine of their own, but from scratch. What happened was that there was a Black Ops group called The Facility, and it had one specific goal: replicate the original Wolverine experiment entirely. The idea was there, but there was one thing standing in their way. The only DNA sample they had from Logan was completely damaged, and due to that, the Y chromosome was just too degraded to salvage, so they started to experiment with it, and after 22 failed attempts, they finally succeeded with clone number 23. That was when geneticist Sarah Kinney decided to step in and made a choice her superiors never approved of. Rather than keep on failing and creating more and more clones, Kinney proposed replacing the damaged genetic material with her own, creating something that wasn't a true clone but more like a genetic daughter carrying Wolverine's abilities. In fact, she even carried out the pregnancy herself, and the resulting child, X-23, was born, but not long after, she was sent off as a product instead of being raised as a child. Due to this specific, inhumane decision, by the time she was just 10 years old, X-23 was already considered to be ready by her own handlers, and her first ever task was to kill a presidential candidate's entire family and staff just to generate maximum publicity for the facility's services. Sarah soon started feeling really guilty about everything she was doing to Laura, and even tried to give her an exit, and this decision cost her everything. Sarah was unaware of the fact that the facility had embedded a trigger scent that was specifically designed to override Laura's mind and force her into a blind rage, and sadly for Sarah, her handlers ultimately used that exact scent to make her kill her own mother. Somehow, Laura did end up fighting her way out of the control of the facility, but she had to carry the trauma given to her by that organization, including the fact that she killed her own mom. The Extremis experiments. The reason we made this list was that not every experiment on it was from an evil scientist or an evil organization. This time, all it took was a pharmaceutical company. Future Farm was regarded as, well, the future of pharmaceuticals, and there, at Future Farm, researcher Maya Hansen built something genuinely radical. Remember Iron Man 3? Well, she created a techno-organic compound that was engineered to rewrite a host's genetic code at the cellular level, where it would literally hijack the body's own repair systems to grow superior organs and trigger rapid healing. On paper, it was a miracle drug. Can you imagine something like that in the real world? People would go crazy for it. Unfortunately for Hansen, she didn't realize that what she had built would be the ultimate weapon if it fell into the wrong hands, and the wrong hands were not so far away. Dr. Aldrich Killian, her own colleague, ended up stealing the Extremis technology from the company vault with Hansen's knowledge and let it fall into the possession of a domestic terrorist named Malin. What followed was something straight out of a horror movie. Malin thought he had everything he needed to become the strongest and ended up injecting himself with the unfinished serum, which mutated him into something that you could barely even call human. He turned completely bulletproof, savage, and the worst part of all, he was on fire but from the inside out. The person who was supposed to save the day was none other than Tony Stark, and even he knew that Malin was way too strong now, so he took a modified version of the serum just to survive his own injuries and interface directly with his armor, which blurred the line between victim and volunteer. You might be wondering, why would Hansen allow the serum to be stolen in the first place? Well, later on in the comics, she admitted that she had willingly allowed Extremis to reach Malin's hands because if it were stolen, she was guaranteed to get her company's defense funding renewed. I guess sometimes the worst experiments are caused by people who are simply trying to maintain a budget. The Golden Sentry Serum. I think at this point we're all aware of who the Sentry is, but very few know how he actually came to be. Well, that's all about to change because this story starts with a broken man who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Golden Sentry Serum traces back to Project Sentry. This was a Cold-era attempt to build a weapon or serum that was stronger and superior to Captain America's super soldier serum. Bureaucracy did what enemy agents couldn't because in just a few decades, the program had splintered into disconnected sub-operations with no central oversight, and pieces of the research simply got farmed out to whoever was willing to keep chasing it. Basically, it was a Hail Mary for whoever still wanted to work on this project, and fortunately for them, a scientist famously known as the Professor was also working on one of these research projects, and he actually managed to crack it. The thing is, he created a serum, but the serum was no ordinary super soldier serum. In fact, calling it that is unfair because it was much closer to a different category of weapon that was so immensely strong that it could grant power on a scale nobody could even imagine, even the people who were working on the project. Honestly, everyone was scared of the serum, so they put off trials, but Robert Reynolds, a meth addict who was just chasing his next high, decided to break into the professor's lab thinking he'd find drugs. Instead, what he found would end up changing his life forever. Without a second thought, he drank the serum and transformed into a being capable of channeling the power of 1,000,000 exploding suns. The people who built it panicked instead of celebrating. They knew this was way too strong, and they ended up destroying every remaining sample, and the project was buried entirely, because the scientists themselves knew that whatever they had made was just not something they could risk getting into the wrong hands. I'm glad that even in comic books, at least someone understood what they should do in situations like this. Nuke and Project Homegrown. Frank Simpson was already a broken person by the time the program found him. Frank was a troubled soldier who came from a family that did nothing but abuse him, and then he was suddenly pulled into the Weapon 7 project. Project 7, better known as Project Homegrown, was basically an offshoot of the same Weapon Plus initiative that would later remake Wolverine. Basically, a whole bunch of evil scientists in the Marvel Universe were trying to remake Captain America, and it's hard to blame them for that. But anyways, Simpson wasn't even supposed to be a weapon. Back when he was deployed in Vietnam, he was infamous for being a rule breaker because instead of completing the kill orders that were given to him by his superiors, he was busy trying to save his comrades who had been injured or were under heavy fire. His instinct of trying to save everyone was something most would cherish, but the program decided that instead of building him up, they had to break him down even more. Handlers knew that they couldn't just wait for him to fall on his own, so they forcefully captured him and tortured him repeatedly until they artificially engineered his breaking point. They kept on doing that until his mind shattered completely, and then they rebuilt him as a partial cyborg that was fitted with a bulletproof subdermal mesh and a second heart wired to a system of color-coded pills that controlled his aggression on command. What emerged was no longer a soldier. Not anymore. It was more like a killing machine with a switch that they could flip on whenever they wanted. The worst part was that Frank wasn't the only victim of this project. The program needed more subjects, so they started to do the same tests and started running entire parallel tracks on convicted criminals and psychopaths by using numerous chemicals and different unknown medicines in an attempt to create a soldier as effective as Captain America. Frank Simpson was turned into the living weapon called Nuke, and he was direct living proof of the fact that the program did indeed work as intended. Nuke was now a man who had the American flag tattooed onto his face and would do anything his handlers asked him to, and he was incapable of remembering who he was before they got to him. Well, we've talked about 10 programs today, 10 decades worth of experiments, but there was one pattern that never changed. Somebody in a lab coat decided another person's body belonged to them. Starting with Wolverine's stolen memories, all the way to an island full of prisoners who didn't even have the right to breathe without permission, you'll notice that if you strip away the powers and the sci-fi aspects, all that remains is real history wearing a costume. This real aspect is what makes these stories stick. You'll probably forget about the sci-fi parts because we've seen a lot of that sort of thing, but the part where somebody's whole being was stolen away from them is something people have a much harder time forgetting, except for the victim who, like Wolverine, usually has permanent damage to his memories. That brings us to the end of this one, but if you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit those like and subscribe buttons so you never miss another update from us. And we've got a lot of ideas for a part 2 on this one, so let us know in the comments down below if you want to see that, and we'll deliver another banger, even better than this one. Otherwise, thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and we'll see you next time.